You said the world needs power, I won't disagree. There's heat in the ground and the wind runs free. You call nuclear the future, but it won't power itself. Nuclear relies on coal more than coal needs itself. You said crypto was coming and demand would explode, that AI would load what the grid couldn't hold. But SMRs stay delayed, no
Hello,
ground
everybody.
ever breaks, and the public pays out while the promise remakes. You said it's the hour, but the plan's still the same. The technology is analog from the Cold War days. There's no place for the waste, and yuccas refused.
I'm Dana, welcome.
Vented dry cast containers become the only refuge.
They were demonstrating. My apologies. Sometimes it takes a few moments to get up to speed.
You say you lead the charge with a federal hand. Would you vote Price Anderson or stand with the land? You call it advanced, but the cycle's well.
Call into these shows,
Still chasing
709.
a fuel that should have stayed into stone.
There we go. It's the Enrichment Man by James Lucid on YouTube. You see links to that site in the bottom of my description after the headlines. Today's headlines are 14 years old. And they're from the first 48 hours. And I had this train of thoughts. I'm trying to distract myself today, and it's continuing into the night. Just let me sort this out, and we're good to go. So these headlines were from the first 48 hours. Excuse me. First 48 hours. And they're very important, as they show us the International Atomic Energy Agency, who's the only one that had the reach to do what it was done in the context of the narrative. It'll make sense. Not meant to be a long show, but it'll be what it's going to be. I was working on it a bit last night and then carried on today. And one of those shows where you don't know if it's ever going to get done. It's such a weird niche, right? But by the time I got through today, I was working on odds and ends today, back and forth, working on odds and ends. I was picking up the guitar. And like a little epiphany. So here we go. And this is IOL, which is South African news. So they've been redacting a lot of their stories from Fukushima. They've been showing up in the search engine. That's how I can quantify it by saying that, right? Because we actually came at one of the headlines, dug up the original headlines, and compared to what they had chopped out. It was quite telling. It was quite startling, really. But they've been doing that a lot. And so I said I should go back and start grabbing documentation before they change everything, right? And they got an incredible archive there on top of that. And so just the first 48 hours, I think I'm just barely scratched in the 72-hour day 3. There's quite a lot of documentation, right? And I can't do everything. Okay, so Japan's quake. So what we're going to do is just going to go through this, and you're going to probably see, I would imagine, the same as I saw. and the reason I'm doing the show tonight, on Saturday, my day off. So day one tsunami, right? Day two, or even day one, but day two is reactor one blew up, and then reactor three. But we're not going to get to reactor 2 or reactor 4, because that's not in the first 48 hours, so to speak. Here we go. At least 6 people were killed, 5 in Fukushima Prefecture. This is after the tsunami, where 4 million homes were without power. So this is clearly early, but it would have been easy to postulate that a lot more than that died, right? That was the first reports, 5 in Fukushima Prefecture. 6 people killed, 5 of them were in Fukushima Prefecture. This was depleted uranium burning at a refinery close to Chiba, 20 kilometers from Tokyo, metropolitan Tokyo, which is a huge area. But this was it was an oil refinery, but it's actually depleted uranium that they were storing there because, as you know, refineries store a lot of toxic stuff, right? Like the one out there in Alberta is storing Agent Orange, amongst other things, and they have a mound that they keep paving over. So it's like a huge mound of pavement that keeps cracking open because of the brutal winters, minus 40-degree temperatures they have there. So every year they got to put more. But it's because it's on a site. I worked there at one point. I was really young. Japanese nuclear plants safe. So this was right away. This is typical, as you know, if you're around here at all, is if there's an earthquake in Timbuktu, the nuclear industry will come and say, the nuclear plant 10,000 miles away wasn't harmed at all. Nothing got off-site. Everything is normal. Don't look at us. We're evil. Like the headline tonight was going to be something like, why does the nuclear industry only hire chicken necks and cowards and morons? Educated morons, don't get me wrong. Bless your heart, you're educated. I get that. But you're morons, face it, right? There's nobody in the nuclear industry that the world relates to because they don't have anybody with a personality in the nuclear industry. Particularly the International Atomic Energy Agency. Natural gas storage tanks burn at the Cosmo oil refinery in Ichihara City, Chiba Prefecture, which is right by Tokyo. 20 kilometers from metropolitan Tokyo, Chiba itself. And this site, I'm not sure how far away that is from the capital, which is Chiba, of the Chiba Prefecture. Excuse me. But that's actually depleted uranium was burning, right? Which is highly toxic, carcinogenic, and radioactive. Japanese media said the government had decided to clear a nuclear power emergency situation, which occurs if there's confirmation of radioactivity leaks. The word leak is always the first word you're going to hear, even if there's no building left, like Chernobyl. Chernobyl's leaking and there's no building left. That's what I mean. The industry is just bizarre. So who's controlling the narrative to be that like to tell these stories as they're happening and do the cover up as it's happening takes skill. You got to have a lot of skill. You really, like, it's beyond a nuclear degree stuff. You got to have decades of being a nuclear scumbag to get that job. Decades of covering it up. So it's natural, right? And you know, there's a lot of people out there that have no emotions, and they can still get educated, get degrees, and get whole jobs and families and everything else. But they're missing an X and a Y, so to speak. Major Kyoto news agency said a fire broke out at Tohoku Electric Power Company's Onagawa nuclear plant in northeastern Japan. So there was a fire broke out. Very little is known. We do have quite a few headlines that I have to go back through to re-educate myself. But it's been a while since because there was 15 reactors couldn't go into cold shutdown in Japan. So Fukushima had 6, the Daiichi had 4. Separately, Fukushima Prefecture said the Tokyo Electric Power Company's plant said the plant's reactor cooling system was working, denying an earlier report that it was malfunctioning. Separately, Fukushima Prefecture, which is the government, denying an earlier report that it was malfunctioning. Well, of course it was. Right, that was well known originally that you had 15 plants couldn't go into cold shutdown because the tsunami took out the external power, and that the reactors were built where this. So you had the earthquake, but more closer to 35, 40 minutes later, according to new evidence that just came out, it was 35 to 40 minutes later that the tsunami came through. So the reactors are on the coastline, so they're going to get hit before the city. So it's, this is where that discrepancy, I guess, comes from. But who controlled the narrative? And so as we go through this, it'll go pretty quick from here on, hopefully, but at least 59 killed in Japan's disaster. So this is immediate headlines we're talking about, right? This was the order that I found them in. The Red Cross in Geneva said the wall of water was higher than some Pacific islands. Well, in some places it rose up to 140 feet. Domestic news agency said a radioactive leak was possible. Radioactive leak. So the one thing to remember for the rest of your life is that when you hear the word leak at a nuclear plant, that's a major accident. And particularly, the more they say it, the more scarier it probably is. It was possible at a nuclear plant in Fukushima. Of course, like any academic would have known, well, you lost your generators and you couldn't go into cold shutdown because you had a tsunami come through your site. So there was nothing you can do. There was nothing functional, right? There was no valves, no electricity. The reactors are dependent on off-site power. Some 2,000 residents have been told to evacuate the area. You didn't need to tell them twice. Prime Minister Nato Khan told politicians they needed to save the country. You have to save the country. A ship carrying 100 people was swept away by the tsunami. And I believe that one they rescued everybody off it out at sea, which was probably the aircraft carrier Ronald Reagan, the USS Ronald Reagan probably done that one. They had sent a flotilla right away, right? Directed. There was 2 aircraft carriers had went there. Japan's disaster shut atomic plant. So the nuclear industry was in absolute panic mode. And they coordinated with all the AP and Reuters. And then the media was basically waiting to be told what they were allowed to say because it's nuclear. And they get paid too, right, by being patient and waiting to be told what to say by the nuclear industry. Don't worry about the truth. Yeah, we've got a reporter right on the ground. Cut him off. Don't give him a second of the satellite. Japan had told the United Nations nuclear watchdog that a heightened state of alert had been declared at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant and the Daiichi. They were identical plants, built identical. Everything was identical. Colors, everything. International Degenerate Agency, IAEA, said it had been informed that the plant had been shut down and no release of radiation has been detected. Well, the plant wasn't shut down. It was a station blackout. It was an emergency by just proxy of a station blackout. And then no release of radiation has been detected. Well, you had a tsunami run through it. There was no one there to detect anything. There was nothing working. But it's a very telling statement that the IAEA, in just the first couple hours, the IAEA was the narrative that showed up. And you'll see that symmetrically. They get referenced in literally every story. The government earlier said a cooling function of Tokyo Electric Power, which is impossible unless it's coordinated, see? A Tokyo Electric Power Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, which is quite frightening that they done that. So that was the cover. They knew it was going to melt down. They knew they were going to blow up. But there was no radioactive leakage. The degenerate International Atomic Energy Agency, the worst humans in history when it comes to the nuclear industry, said in a statement, the nuclear fuel required continued cooling even after a plant is shut down. It's got 50 minutes before it starts to overheat to the point where the fuel starts to swell up. You can't switch it off once that happens. The fuel is already vulnerable because it's full of trillions of microscopic cracks from the neutron bombardments. This is why they take it out of the reactors fairly quick. It's still splitting atoms in the fuel pools. The fuel pools were the key at Fukushima. The reactors, they knew they were going to blow because they're high pressure reactors. So they're over 1,000 pounds per square inch in normal mode. And so once they lose power, it heats up. So your pressure increases immediately. And because you have no infrastructure whatsoever for the entire coastline, let alone Fukushima plant, no hopes of getting it back. They're not naive. They're just evil. They're not gullible. They're not stupid. They're just evil. They're missing a gene. It's not their fault. The industry chose them because they were dysfunctional, right? They're incredibly educated, but they were soulless, ruthless, and heartless. To be polite, I'm being polite by calling them that. There's a lot more appropriate names they should be using. Japanese authorities also reported a fire in Okinawa nuclear disease factory, which has since been extinguished. I don't know for sure if that was true, but International Atomic Energy Agency statement said they're controlling the narrative 100%, right? If they're being quoted in the story, they wrote the story, minimum, on top of that. Japanese authorities also, and then the journalists at whatever media regurgitated it, got the kickback for allowing the International Degenerate Agency to piggyback off their medias. That's how they make money, right? The scum of the earth, the Japanese scum of the earth / authorities, also reported a fire, which has since been extinguished, the Degenerate Agency statement said, had informed the International Atomic Energy Agency. Everybody was coordinated with the IAEA. The prevailing winds are blowing eastward away from the Japanese coast, it said, writers. Now, which wasn't true, right? There's 4 million emails linked below to the Nuclear Regulatory Commissions from the Freedom of Information Acts. And as you start to peel through some of that stuff, and you're talking about over 4 million emails, a lot of it's redacted, not all of it. And they were showing the winds patterns. We covered quite a bit. We couldn't cover everything. But clearly their assertion, like, have you ever seen a snowstorm where the wind just blew one direction? Right, it swirls around, and every community is going to be different topography around the mountains, the regions, the coastal temperatures, the lake temperatures. There's so many factors. There's no way the wind is per se, right, going to be just blown straight as a whip. It doesn't work that way. Death toll soars in Japan's disaster. Death toll soars. There's still not, up to 300 bodies were found in the coastal city of Sendai. Just a far cry from the 20,000, right? So clearly this is very early stuff. Some 3,000 residents living near a nuclear plant in Fukushima Prefecture north of Tokyo were told to evacuate was a precaution after the reactor cooling malfunction. It wasn't a precaution. They knew they were waiting for it to go kabooey, to melt down, etc., right? Excuse me. Thank you, everybody. Hi. 6 votes. Let's bring up the poll here. There we go. We got 9 people. We got 6 votes, 8 likes. To anything questioning the International Atomic Energy Agency will be censored heavily. No one beats them up. Unfortunately, right? There should be just tens of thousands of people spitting every time they hear their name. Did the International Atomic Degenerate Agency know the explosions of reactor 1 and 3 were the fuel pools detonating, not hydrogen explosions? Yes. Just let me. What they've done is just, how do we forgive the nuclear industry? How does that work, see? How do you forgive them for the perpetual cover-ups right from the get-go? And by doing that, they compromised humanity and the 8 million species now. They're your problem. Your biggest problem on this planet is the nuclear industry, and the retards they pick for the international degenerate agencies are an unbelievably important facet of this equation, right? Now, because we're only talking about reactor 1 and reactor 3. Just make sure I'm set up here. It was. Here you go. Let me do this. Because you're only talking about the first 42 hours. But you had reactor 1 blow up, and you had reactor 3 at the end of the story blowing up, right? All right. So they would have had access to that picture. And many like it. This is the Fukushima Daiichi plant. So if you're in the nuclear industry, particularly the Degenerate International Atomic Energy Agency, then you were able to extrapolate that this is going south. Nothing you can do about it, because there's nothing functional. Doesn't matter how stoic the people on site are, bless their hearts, there was nothing they can do. So reactor 3 is to your left. There were several strong aftershocks in Tokyo that were there was widespread panic in Tokyo. We got videos of Tokyo, and the buildings are just swaying like forever, and incredible like distances. It was very visible. 1,000 plus killed in Japan. There was a lot of liquefaction too, right there. 1,000 plus killed in Japan disaster. So very early in the story, when you're seeing stuff like that. Thousands of residents were evacuated from an area around a nuclear plant north of Tokyo after fears of a radiation leak, and officials said problems with the reactor cooling systems were not at a critical level. So at what point does... Will the truth show up? Well, it won't. So they knew this. They knew there was no cooling whatsoever. So if there's no cooling, it's not just cooling, like taking water from the ocean and circulating, which is a big deal, because you need 1 million gallons a minute. It's 4,500 tons a minute of water for each reactor. And think of 4,500 one-ton pickup trucks going past your front door every morning when you're trying to cross the street to get in your car. This is impossible amount we're talking about per minute. 1,440 minutes a day. Now on top of that, the water has to circulate. So it's horrifying if that doesn't happen. If you can't put that 1 million gallons a minute to cool the reactor, boil water too, right? For 1 million homes and businesses. But the water has to circulate. And so none of that was all I'm not going to use the word disabled. I'm going to use the word destroyed, because that's what happened. Everybody knew, except for the International Atomic Energy Agency can't use those words, because then the cover story doesn't work. Underscoring grave concerns about the plant, the United States Air Force delivered coolant to the nuclear site slash facility. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said. She also said in emails that were released that it's best not to go outdoors for a couple of days. Now, you can deliver all the water you want. You got nothing there that's going to work. So that wasn't true. And what Hillary Clinton done, and the Americans done, that wasn't true. They couldn't. First off, you got 4,500 helicopters, or 2,000 helicopters carrying 2 tons of water each every minute. Nothing's making sense, right? Or the fuel pools need at least 120,000 liters a day, or the fuel rods in them, which is decades of reactor cores, become exposed. All that's, by the way, still splitting atoms. That's why fuel is dangerous, because it's splitting atoms. Those atoms will poison everything on the planet. You don't need nuclear meltdowns. You don't need events. Underscoring grave concern about the plant, the U.S. Air Force delivered coolant to the facility. That makes no sense. Japanese politicians pushed emergency budget to fund relief efforts. Let me move the Geiger counter for a second. After Khan, which is Prime Minister Khan of Japan, asked him to save the country. In other words, throw everything you got at this. You got multiple disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, nuclear meltdowns, fuel pools detonating. In the first couple of days, you had 18 reactor cores melted down in the first 2 days. These are catastrophic. Like your lungs, your organs melt in proximity, and because they ejected the fuel right out of the buildings. Let me show you. Very visible explosions. Reactor 1 and Reactor 3. That's Reactor 3. But as the plume in the French government study showing a spike of 10 million times pre-Fukushima levels of cesium-137 per cubic meter of air, covering the entire planet in 23 days. And with the explosion you're looking at is 9 reactor cores. That's what's making all the. It's not smoke. It's 9 reactor cores burning in the air. Reactors are not like wood burning or whatever. You're talking about isotopes. That looks like smoke, but it's not. This is just a monster plume you're looking at right there. That's the fuel pools have ignited because of the zirconium cladding, are burning, and the trails as they're falling, you'll see these trails. The videos are very grainy, but nevertheless, there's nothing else there to create that material. Let me show you what I mean by that. Now, and that's the International Atomic Energy Agency was aware, really aware. So at the top of the buildings, so there's the fuel pool right there with 8 reactor. There's 4 reactor cores in that pool, 4 in the other one on the same building. The top of the building, there's nothing there. These were additions. These are ductworks, and you can see the vent up there in the top corner, and there's a couple of vents right up there. These are ductworks. These were an addition to the building years later to vent, because the fuel in the pool is still splitting atoms and noble gases and everything. And the releases just from a nuclear plant are each day from the fuel pools are catastrophic to everybody within 1,000 miles. Japan fights radiation crisis at the plant. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said the U.S. Air Force had delivered coolant to avert a rise in temperature to the facility's nuclear reactor. Well, that's not simply. The entire infrastructure was torn apart, like at 500 miles per hour. Can you imagine swimming in what you're looking at right there? And when that goes out, there's nothing left functional. And I should have been just bear with me. Make it. The intention not to do a long show tonight. Let's keep rolling. Let me just talk about the story. Kyoto News Agency quoted the company saying that the radiation level was rising in the turbine buildings, and the pressure had risen to 1.5 times the design capacity, so they're over 1,000 pounds per square inch. But why would the turbine building see radiation rising? There's a meltdown going on. And the pressure had risen to 1.5. Well, if the meltdown's going on, you wouldn't have that pressure because it already would have detonated. 1.5 times, which is say it's 1,500 pounds per square inch. Now, first off, how are you going to measure 1.5 times when you have no power anywhere? Even if fuel rods are exposed, it does not mean they would start melting right away. The leader of the nuclear energy group at the Japanese Institution of Energy Economics. And so why would they come out with that statement? Because that's a very controlled statement, right? Even if the fuel rods melt and the pressure inside the reactor builds up, radiation would not leak as long as the reactors contain or functions well. But like the reason you had the issue was because a tsunami ran through the site. So you're not going to have any functions. So the expert, Tomoko, leader of the nuclear energy group at the Japanese Institute of Energy Economics, was speaking for who? This had to be coordinated. They're not going to come out with these assertions on their own. Every time there's any kind of event with the nuclear industry has to control every facet, like right to the minutest detail. They have to control the narrative. TEPCO confirmed the water levels were falling, but it was working to avert any exposure of the nuclear fuel rods. Well, TEPCO is not a decommission authority. They're not experts on nuclear meltdowns. The company who made the reactors, Mitsubishi, should have been airlifted in there, right? Not TEPCO was nothing. They were just administration. But they're there so you don't blame the nuclear industry, see? Residents within 2 miles of the radius, 3 kilometers of the plant, were told to evacuate from the area. Well, they're not going to do that unless there's a vent. Chief Cabinet Secretary Adano, who should be, because this person, what he done, is uncalled for. He happily stole the health of everybody on the planet. This guy, and every species. The government is making every effort to restore the cooling system. You can't restore the cooling system because you had a tsunami run through it. Many reactors are located in earthquake-prone zones such as Fukushima and Fukushima. That's an interesting statement. Many reactors are located in active earthquake-prone zones. They're right on tectonic plates, basically, where you're guaranteed to have the worst type of earthquakes. Website for Japan's missing quake victims. People swept out to sea. Japan to release radioactive vapor. You can't release radioactive vapor because you had a tsunami run through the site. So clearly this was a structured narrative was starting to develop. Mari Yamaguchi, who has the credibility of a serial killer, right, who we've covered I don't know how many times, just a horrific monster. And I left comments on her Twitter site and called her that too, by the way. You had a tsunami running through the communities and farmlands and everything else, carrying villages and ships and everything else. It was like unbelievable. The authorities will release slightly. How are you going to release slightly radioactive? There's nothing released. Just bear with me, I lost my way here. Right there. Like, once this runs through your site at 500-600 miles per hour, there's nothing functional. You can't go turning valves, blah, blah, blah. to ease pressure at the nuclear reactor while the cooling system failed. It didn't fail, it was just swept away, like everything else. Remember, there was 2,000 square miles out in the Pacific Ocean after this of debris. That's the size of Texas. Of debris that got washed out from the coastline. This is only one picture of it. Hang on, I was supposed to be down here somewhere so I can get that stuff to show to you. I'm almost there. Just makes it easier to tell the story, right? It'll take a minute. Yeah, that's a good picture. This is reactor 1 is about to explode, which is to your left. It hasn't exploded yet, allegedly, right? But they know it's going to explode because they had a tsunami run through it. And so they know that the pressure is building up. I think I'm like a pack rat. I have so much. All right, this will do. So you had a tsunami run through the site, and cities and communities and country, prefecture after prefecture. It's the gallows laugh, right? So it does a lot of damage, and so what you're seeing is a tsunami coming through. You're not seeing after. So try to keep that in mind. Japan warns of small radiation leak. Hillary Clinton said the U.S. Air Force delivered coolant to avert a rise in temperature at the facility's nuclear rods. That doesn't work that way. Pressure built in the plant was set to be released soon, a move that could result in a radiation leak. It doesn't work that way because tsunami ran through the site, right? Tsunami ran through the site. After tsunami goes, there's nothing functional left. It's possible that the radioactive material in a reactor vessel could leak outside, but the amount is expected to be small, and the winds are blowing towards the sea will be considered. Chief Cabinet. So it's a very structured narrative that started to emerge. Residents are safe after those within a 3 kilometer were evacuated, and within 10 kilometers are staying indoors. So, like the plume within 10 kilometers was lethal doses, which we covered last week when we audited Harvard University's video response from 14 years ago. But there's other documentation that backs up those assertions. So we want people to be calm, he added. Chief Cabinet Idano, the monster of Fukushima. The situation is still several stages away from 3 Mile Island, where the reactor container ceased to function as it should. Well, the reactors of Fukushima ceased to function as they should too, if you want to put it that way. Said Tomoko, the leader of the nuclear energy group, Japanese Institute of Energy Economics, so he was quoted again. Many reactors are located, because we covered them in that other story, right? Many reactors are located in earthquake-prone zones, such as Fukushima Fukai. Many reactors are located in earthquake-prone zones. Well, they're on tectonic plates. You built them in the worst possible spot where you knew at some point, the engineers who built it knew at some point it would melt down, and that the fuel pools being at the top of the buildings, you would have no access, so they would melt down too. This was designed to happen. Whether they made it happen because they got tired of waiting is one thing. You can debate that too. The International Atomic Energy Agency estimated that around 20% of the nuclear reactors around the world are currently operating in areas of significant seismic activity. Significant seismic activity. Right? And there's some postulation that the reactors work better in these zones. There's some kind of a energy that is able to be tapped into. I don't know if it's true or not. Nothing surprises me anymore after all these years. I'm not suggesting that's true. I'm not suggesting it's not true. It just happens to be something that was floated around an awful lot. And there's a lot. There's lots to be considered. 20% of the nuclear reactors around the world currently operating in areas of significant seismic activity. In other words, built in the worst possible places. The International Degenerate Agency, IAEA, said the sector began putting more emphasis on external hazards after an earthquake hit the TEPCO's Kariwa plant in July 2007. Until then, the largest to ever affect a nuclear facility. And the earthquake hit that plant that was on the east side over by Ishikawa Prefecture, not far from the Noto Peninsula earthquake they had, a significant one they had in 2024, January 1st. 4 reactors shut down automatically. Water containing radioactive material was released into the ocean in 2007, right, which is the Japanese Sea, across from South Korea, but without an adverse effect on human health or environment. You can't quantify that assertion. How much was released? Where was it released from? And it will eventually affect human health and the environment. It has to affect the environment. IOL, this is all from the same media now, which is regurgitating mostly writers' stories, right? Because they're using spider bots, I would imagine, to aggregate any stories from Reuters and AP. So they show up on their website automatically, so you get the same picture, the same author, the same paragraph, symmetrically all around the world at one time. They have around 1,600 plus, who knows how many in reality, medias that will take the story directly, but who knows how many of the sites that grab the story don't have spider bots grabbing them from other sites too, right? You know that's happening. Japan battles a crisis at the nuclear plant. Well, there's nothing you can do. And so this is Fukushima before it went pop. The authorities are battling to contain rising pressure in nuclear reactors damaged by a massive earthquake. Were forced to release radioactive steam from one plant on Saturday after evacuating tens of thousands of residents from the area. Well, there was no, the big problem with the story is when the tsunami comes through, it leaves that behind, so there's nothing functional. And because this is the site, then this is what it would look like after. So you couldn't release it. So the accident started. It must have burned through and then it finally exploded. I don't know. Officials, I don't think anybody really does. Officials said that so far the level of radiation leakage was small. A professor at the University of Tokyo said a major radioactive disaster was unlikely. Shinkimura, whoever, a professor, which is all the professors at university's job is to be pigs with their students, create little monsters, and if there's an accident somewhere, you have to, and you're called on to cover it up. You got to tell the biggest lie that's ever been told. Otherwise, you can't get a tenure at that university. You got to play with the university all the time. You got to before you can become a full-time professor, you have to cover up. They got to have enough crimes on you that you can never rat them out before you get a full professor. Even in the worst case scenario, that would mean some radioactive leakage and equipment damage, but not an explosion. If venting is done carefully. Like the tsunami ran through the country and the site. How are you going to vent it carefully? You have no control. And if the radiation is rising, it means you can't get near it. TEPCO said it lost ability to control pressure in some of the reactors at the Daiichi plant, which is 10 miles south. It's identical as it had with the Daiichi plant. They had no control at the Daiichi either, because there's nothing functional, right? Pressure was stable inside the reactor at the Daiichi plant, and you know what the releases probably were at Fukushima? Hang on. I say it was the original releases were probably the common spent fuel pool. This is the common spent fuel pool. It was completely redacted in 736 pictures that were released. That's the common spent fuel pool right there. That's reactor 4 up there, and reactor 3. But behind this is on the same street as reactor 1, 2, 3, and 4. Reactor 4 is right across the street. And that's the ocean is that way up there. So what you're looking here is transport truck containers piled up because the wave came in around that side, and threw them all in this pile. Transport truck containers. Because they were storing a lot of transport truck containers here, look. And that's what these buildings are. Inside of that is transport truck containers. That's where they were putting other nuclear waste, I would imagine. That's the common spent fuel pool, which took excess fuel from 6 reactor buildings because their fuel pools were filled up. And so they had to take some out, put somewhere. Some of that was in dry cast between reactor 1, 2, 3, and 4 and reactor 5 and 6, which was north of the site. So I would say, because they had windows on one side of this building that would have allowed the water to get in there. Once you compromised the water, it would have let off enormous amount of radiation, because you probably had like 6,500 assemblies or something. I can't remember. It was around 11 million pounds in the common spent fuel pool. I would say that was the original releases. That's why they couldn't do nothing. They couldn't get near the buildings. Pressure at one Daiichi reactor, reactor number 1, may have risen 2.1 times the design capacity, the trade ministry. Why is the trade ministry being quoted? Which is another really interesting thing. You don't see the appropriate ones being quoted, right? You see, like, trade ministry, really? So multiple thousands of pounds per square inch. The reactors are, at that point, they were 40 years old almost, and so they were very brittle because of the gamma shines and the beta rays, the neutron bombardments, the alpha. And that's why they originally only had a design life for 30 years, because of that particular attribute from the neutron bombardment destroys the integrity. So when you rise to double the pressure, then you knew this. The International Degenerate Agency knew this immediately. That the only outcome of this was going to be the pressure was going to continue to rise till she blew up. But what they weren't counting on was the fact that the common spent fuel pool was on the same street, and it's not a very tall building. So that would have been compromised again immediately. That's why that would explain the common spent fuel pool would explain the heavy radiation originally. Before reactor 1 had blown up, which is to your left. Once the reactor 1 blew up, within 24 hours, it threw 8 reactor cores all over the site. And then a day and a half later, reactor 3 done the same thing. So you had 18 reactor cores by the end of 48 hours. There was nothing functional, right? Radiation levels detected at the control unit of the reactor, the Daiichi plant, were 1,000 times the normal level. Not yet at a level requiring workers to evacuate. Well, 1,000 times normal is evacuation by far. And there's nothing you can do because you had a tsunami run through the site. Hang on. A union of unconcerned scientists, a U.S.-based non-profit organization started up by the Manhattan Project scientists. Like their board of directors, like 34 people. All of them with incredible degrees and accolades. They're a lobbying group for the nuclear industry that dressed up as not. But when you look at their board of directors, when you look at how much influence, who created them, everything else, you're left with with a think tank basically for the nuclear industry, that you go to them. Why would you go to the Union of Non-Concerned Scientists this early in the game? Because they're pro-nuclear dressed up as anti-nuclear, right? 250,000 in emergency shelters. They don't give you any dates on any of the stories, and they don't give you what you can extrapolate, right? And you don't give you the names of the authors. That's the worst kind of news, right? There's nothing to be trusted, see? But it does show the International Atomic Energy Agency had complete control over the narrative. Day after massive quake and tsunami struck the country, so this is Saturday, the next day, attempted to ease the building reactor pressure by releasing radioactive steam. Once the tsunami runs through the site, there's nothing functional left, right? No matter where you tell. Nuclear no different than a community. Tokyo Electric Power Company attempted to ease the building's pressure by releasing radioactive steam. The company stressed the move posed no health risk. So they were losing radiation, I would imagine, from the common spent fuel pool at that stage, because reactor 1 hasn't exploded yet. Over 1,000 feared dead. So really early. It's still really, really early. No one has any clue what's really going on. But they would have been able to, like the media would have known thousands were dead. Not 1,000 feared dead. Right? It could have easily put 4,000 or 10,000. And most of the media would have chose that option. Right? Because it was well known, true, the helicopter footage was broadcast on TV as the tsunami came through. The Defense Ministry said 1,800 homes Minamasoma, nuclear wasteland Minamasoma, Fukushima Prefecture, was destroyed. And the Sendai authority said 1,200 houses were toppled by the tsunami. 1,200 houses is a big stretch. Thousands more homes were destroyed in a string of coastal towns, including where 300 houses collapsed or swept away. In the quake-hit area, 5.6 million households had no power, and 1 million houses had no water. I don't know why this picture was redacted. Radioactive leak near the quake-hit plant. Radioactive leak. And then they give you this purposely blurred picture that at some point wasn't blurred. Radioactive cesium, which is a British terminology, right? Only the British pronounce cesium as cesium with an A. So that's the hand of the British nuclear industries in there. Radioactive cesium had been found. And whenever you hear stuff like that, cesium, there's 1,000 isotopes you're worried about. Cesium is definitely one of them, but the biggest byproduct of radiated fuel rod is an isotope known as curium. So that would have been the biggest release. And you need lead shielding 20 times thicker than you do for plutonium. Curium's got a 250,000 half-life. So it's around forever and ever and ever. It's got 10 half-lives. The nuclear plants of Fukushima. The find comes as concerns rose about increasing radiation levels around the power station. As concerns rose. You had a tsunami run through it. Like the coastline and several kilometers interior. IOL, this media is independent online, popularly known as IOL. It's independent online is the actual name of the media. Is one of South Africa's leading news and information websites. And they have an absurd amount of subsidy websites too. So they're a big player. Like they have a list there on that page. If you go to their site, you'll see a list of their affiliated websites. Excuse me. Ryohei Shimomi, or whatever, said that officials were checking whether a meltdown had taken place at the Fukushima, because Unit 1. It's lost cooling in the aftermath of the earthquake, and said even if there was a meltdown, it wouldn't affect humans beyond a 6-mile radius, which is absurd to even suggest that radiation has a limit. Just let me show you one of these. Too much scrolling. The plume to your left, the second one from the bottom, is 24 days of radioactive fallout. And so anybody in the know that $51,000 residents are living within the radius that have been evacuated. Most of the 51,000 victims were living in a 10-kilometer radius were evacuated, is what he's saying, right? Evacuation is not going to help because you've done it too late. Is the context? After authorities detected 8 times normal radiation levels outside the facility and 1,000 times normal inside Unit 1 control room. That's simply not true. Right? That's not true because hang on. Because once the tsunami ran through the site, there's no functions whatsoever. Nothing. No light bulbs, no plugs, not going running extension cords through the rubble. And no one's going inside of the reactor. So why would the control room, which is quite a ways away from the reactor, have 1,000 times normal, which there's no breach? That was a common spent fuel pool, I would imagine. The government declared, as I showed you earlier, the government declared a state of emergency at the Daiichi unit, the first at a nuclear plant in Japan's history. Hours later, TEPCO, which operates the 6 reactors, announced that it lost cooling ability at a second reactor there, and at 3 units at its nearby Fukushima Daiichi plant. So the Daiichi plant had 3 units they had no control over at the same time. We're in what's known as a station blackout. Japan's Nuclear Safety Agency said the situation was most dire at Fukushima Daiichi Unit 1. Now, so it still hasn't detonated, where pressure had risen to twice what is considered the normal level. Which, you're talking about several thousand pounds per square inch. You're talking about several thousand pounds per square inch. You go backwards. Yeah. The International Atomic Energy Agency said. So this is in the first 24 hours. Why are they being quoted everywhere? Explosions heard at the nuclear plant. So in that picture there, nothing is blown up. An explosion was heard and smoke was seen. Japan earlier in the day warned of a meltdown at the nuclear reactor. Earlier in the day warned of a meltdown at the nuclear reactor damaged. And they always put the tsunami earthquake. Even today, you'll still see that constantly shoved down your throat. It said the risk of radiation contamination was small. So this was, they had decided they were going to cover it up. They haven't decided entirely how the story was going to play because they had multiple reactors they figured were going to blow up over the next couple of days. And so it was absolutely urgent that if they had a meltdown that they told the world, and that the world had an ability now to come up with some kind of solutions to try to minimize things. And they decided they wanted to cover it up. The International Atomic Energy Agency was the only one that had control of the media worldwide through the UN about brainwashing machine. I have no words for this story. So all the headlines are really weird. If you look at the headlines underneath my video, you see the majority of headlines are like 4, 5, 6 words. A stranded elderly woman was carried on the back of a Japanese soldier. Bless their hearts. In shattered towns along the vast Pacific coast where a massive tidal wave devoured and spat out entire neighborhoods with houses, cars, and people. Nuclear power plants. Japan worried about a meltdown at the Fukushima #1 reactor 250 kilometers northeast of Tokyo, where the cooling system broke and fire engines were pumping water to douse super hot radioactive fuel. There was only one fire engine survived. But there was no infrastructure because a tsunami ran through. Right? There was no heavy equipment. There was no heavy equipment at this stage. Where was I? Oh. Right there. Yeah, so there was only one fire engine, but you had a tsunami run through your site. And so there was nothing passable. The fire engine couldn't go anywhere in this time frame that we're talking about. An explosion was later reported there, and so the story is structured. They got control every time. Yeah, there's explosions. Yeah, there's fires. Yeah, there's releases. It's okay because we got fire trucks, and they just tell all these lies to explain away. Right, so they tell you the truth, then they tell you a lie to cover up what's really going on, so to speak. The cooling system was also damaged by the quake in another plant, the Fukushima #2 reactor. A very personal issue for the Suzuki family. I got no idea why that would be there. Blast at quake-hit nuclear plant. A quake-hit nuclear plant, sorry. That picture again. The blast came as plant operators worked desperately to reduce the pressure in the core. They couldn't do it because you had a tsunami run through the site at 500, 600 miles per hour, multiple ones. Could lead to the release of radiation into the atmosphere. So they were setting the stage for the release. They knew it was going to happen. It was probably already happening at the common spent fuel pool. They were waiting for reactor 1, 2, 3, or 4 to detonate. They knew that was going to happen. An unchecked rise, but they didn't tell you that. An unchecked rise in temperature could cause the core to essentially turn into a molten mass, but burn through the reactor vessel. Risk Information Service Stratford said in the report, this may lead, and we have folders and folders on them, this may lead to a release of an unchecked amount of radiation to the containment building that surrounds the reactor. So this was the official story just showing up right there. And to the structure surrounding the reactor, not the reactor, see? So they're talking about the spent fuel pool when they're talking about that one, by the way. NHK Television, GG, said the outer structure of the building that houses the reactor appeared to be blown off. All right, now we're finally getting somewhere. So now they're saying reactor 1 blew up. Here we go. Now they had footage of it. They had video of it. So this wasn't a conjecture. They had video of it. And the only thing that can make that plume, which was the fuel pool ejected out of the building and then it catches fire. And as it's falling, it's releasing massive plumes. It's the definition of hell for a planet on top of that, which could suggest the containment building had already been breached. The explosions were caused by a meltdown, whether it was from the fuel pool or the reactor core. The reactor core, once it overheats, gets so hot, the pressure builds up. All the fuel is already dissolved, so to speak, right? And so that's going to contribute to the explosive. So the pressure explodes, then it hits oxygen. When the oxygen hits the hydrogen, it explodes again. So this is all milliseconds or something. So you got a vessel that's at double its capacity. It's not designed So it's like a car tire, right? You just keep putting air into it until it blows up. And that's the same as the reactor vessels. You just keep putting pressure there until they blew up. It was done under heat instead of by an air source, right? Like a tire. And then once the oxygen rushes in, it continues to explode. So it's very violent explosions. But reactor 3, because you're aerosoling the uranium, the plutonium. And that's really true coming up in the next 24 hours, was reactor 3 detonated. And the difference is incredible because that was a plutonium mixed oxide reactor. So they had it all scripted out how this was going to play out. And then they were doing the press releases to account for it just before it happens. So people would just kind of brush it off, right? Oh, well, they knew this was going to happen. Earlier, the operator released what it said was a tiny amount. Just before that happened. A tiny amount of radioactive steam. How do you release a tiny amount of radioactive steam, right? After, like a tsunami ran through the site. That's the end of everything. Everything is wrecked. There's nothing functional whatsoever on the entire site. And the danger is minimal because tens of thousands of people have already been evacuated from the vicinity. So the danger was minimal because people were no longer in those communities. Well, what about the people at the plant? Does all the radiation immediately move away from the site? Because once it exploded, and it did, you can't get back on the site. Right? Once that happens, you're not going on that site. Your organs melt in 5 or 10 minutes. Even if you try to run past something, your organ starts melting and it doesn't stop till you die, right? It liquefies. And the danger is minimal because tens of thousands of people are already evacuated. And by no means did everybody evacuate. There was no power. People didn't get the message. They had no service on their phones. There was no warnings. There was nobody in the communities. There were, a lot of people still not rescued for 4 or 5 days. Like, it's not like a normal... It's not like the plant has an issue and everything else around. All the communities have the options. Nobody had any options, right? The roads, highways were all blocked with people trying to escape the tsunami. The tsunami was a significant, resource-intensive event, right? The main island in Japan had actually shifted 2.4 meters, which is over 7 feet. That would have separated the water intakes. 1 million gallons a minute wouldn't have been functional even if everything else had kept working. Radiation leaking, and that's such a disgusting word. And the fact that the nuclear industry, that's their preferred word. Every time you hear the word leaking, you should be arresting people at IAEA in the nuclear industry. Fukushima leaked from a damaged Japanese radiation leak from a damaged Japanese nuclear reactor north of Tokyo on Saturday. The government said after an explosion blew the roof off the facility. After an explosion blew the roof off a facility. Not a nuclear reactor, but a facility. Not a nuclear reactor. I should have a picture of reactor 1 there for you, shouldn't I? Reactor 1 is the farthest one away. Let me find another picture for you before I go any further because it's very deceptive, right? You gotta realize how big these buildings were. 19-story buildings, 65 meter, 190 feet tall buildings. They were built very strong. Let me go find that picture of reactor 1. It's easier to go look for it than it is for me to try to find it here in my pile. I hope. That don't mean I'm going to get a really good picture for you, but there we go. Oh, shit. It's okay. Let me do this again. Because reactor 1 was the only building that kind of stayed intact. So that's reactor 1. I got a better picture than that here, sorry. Reactor 1 was a quite unusual one. That's reactor 1. So it's hard, it's very deceptive because you look at it, it doesn't look too bad, right? The fuel pool burnt off though. That was the fuel pool burning off. There's nothing at the top of the buildings to account for that material. Here we go. How about this one? But see, because that doesn't look so bad, right? Does it? That sure does. What created that? That was the fuel pool. So, how can I explain it to you? Once one of the reactors melt down, you can't get near the other ones. The government said after an explosion blew the roof off, so they take off the facility. Not reactor, but facility. So they actually put a Kevlar sarcophagus. They built it off-site and then assembled it. And these are big panels. You can see one of the big panels getting lifted up. And there's no one up there, of course, because it's a nuclear meltdown with 9 reactor cores. And so they had left that in place for 5 years, and then they removed it. Now the material is so radioactive. If you took a square foot of it and put it in the wall of a subway, everybody walks past it for 1,000 years will die that day. It's like a radioactive. They've done that to try to control the emissions so that the homeless wouldn't be dropping dead too fast on site. The government said the explosion blew the roof off the facility. Development raised fears of a meltdown, as the officials scrambled to contain what could be the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. Japan's media estimated at least 1,300 people were killed. So this is still very early in the story. Right, 1,300 people is not even, it's a very small fraction, right? Idano said evacuation radius is 6 miles from the stricken 40-year-old Daiichi 1 reactor plant, Fukushima Prefecture, was adequate, but an hour later the boundary was extended to 20 kilometers. See, the problem, they had to move the people out of the immediate zone because of those big plumes. And how do you account for people 15 miles away lying dead in streets and homes, right? So you had to get them out of there before that plume got there. So they did probably go there with helicopters and everything else and chase people out of there as quick as they could, because we know the plume within 10 kilometers was a lethal dose. TV footage showed vapors. These are not vapors. These are lethal doses of radiation rising from the plant. Along the northeast coast, rescue workers searched through the rubble of destroyed buildings, cars, boats. There was areas where they couldn't go in for 3 months or something because of the radiation to get the bodies out. They could see the bodies. They couldn't retrieve them because of the radioactive fallout. Hardest hit areas in the city of Sendai, 180 kilometers northeast. So it's between Fukushima and Tokyo. Days residents hoarded water, huddled in makeshift shelters near freezing temperatures. And Chernobyl nuclear plants sent thousands of tons of toxic nuclear dust billowing across Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, and it was the worst civilian nuclear accident. The blast at the Japanese nuclear facility came as, so they're suggesting Japan didn't do that, see? You know, of course it did. Workers, they worked desperately to reduce the pressure in the cores of the reactor. You couldn't do nothing. A tsunami ran through it. There was nothing functional. If you just get it, once the reactor blew up, by the way, you couldn't even get back on the site. Company had a rocky past in the dust. If you did, it's a lethal sentence, right? They did send people in, but there was nothing you can do. It was just for cameras or something. Public relation. Plagued by scandal, the nuclear industry pre-Fukushima. And the president of the country's largest power utility was forced to resign with 4 other senior executives pre-Fukushima. for falsification of nuclear plant safety records. There was a long history of this, by the way. It's a very powerful structure, but the structure is full of morons. And so they do some stupid shit to each other, right? The Canadian nuclear, one of the Canadian nuclear plant sites had this, had academics or scientists there that were pissed off with the employees and actually put radioactive material in the coffee pots. Poison them, right? But the nuclear experts said this did not necessarily mean the nuclear reactor had been breached. And the outer structure of the reactor building that housed the reactor appeared to have been blown off. So they knew that when that happened, that was the meltdown. That was the fuel pools had melted down and detonated. Right? Like, we have the luxury of hindsight on top of that. And so you can say with fact certain things. So a couple of days later, but we're not going to get to that tonight. A couple of days later, reactor 4 blew up. Now, officially, that never happened. The official story is that they got all the fuel out of it, and it was all sunshine and buttercups, right? That's the crazy thing about the whole story. Like, this is just a fraction of media pretending they're 150 feet above the stump to your left of reactor 4. How, in goodness gracious, is that acceptable? The international community started to send disaster relief teams on Saturday to help Japan, with the United Nations sending a group to help coordinate the work. So again, United Nations is in charge. Why would you put these rejects of humanity in charge of anything? Like, if you know the crimes they're committing worldwide all the time, you wouldn't give them 2 seconds of your time outside of some contempt, maybe. The main island in Japan is shifted 2.4 meters. So again, their assertion. The world sends disaster relief teams to Japan, but not Fukushima. Fukushima wouldn't take anybody. No, mind your own business. Go help the victims you want to, but stay away from nuclear plant. This is Miyagi Prefecture, and what's the name of that city? Get my head out of the way here. Ishinomaki. With the United Nations sending a group to help coordinate the work. Why is United Nations put on a pedestal every single story? We are in the process of deploying 9 experts who are among the most experienced. We've seen your experts. They're just horrific scumbags and serial killers. Your experts are the worst humans we've ever created every single time. United Nations shouldn't exist, right? United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They create the humanitarian affairs and then they're in charge of it too. What do you think they're up to? Doing that routine. They're just scum, right? There's nothing good. There are people there who are so compartmentalized they think they're a good organization, but that's because they're morons too, right? That's who they hire. They have this ability to find highly educated morons in universities that are incapable of going out and getting a job, but capable of getting degrees, and then bring them into the scumbag fold and weaponize them against humanity. The team of UN disaster relief officials includes several Japanese speakers and environmental experts from the industry. See? Their job is to cover up. We can go through tons of them if we want to. An explosion blew the roof off, again. See that narrative? Blew the roof off. An unstable nuclear reactor. Japanese Chief Cabinet Secretary Yukio Idano, which is this piece of shit right there. Japanese media estimated at least 1,300 people were killed. Still very early in the stories, right? The UN announced, again, right, there's this asphyxiation. It's either the journalists are all fixated on UN and their subsidies, like IAEA and Unsclear and ERP and the IPRC, or that's who's writing the story. and then the journalists are putting their names on it. In order to tell a lie so consistent, it has to be coordinated. This is total pandemonium. Community stripped right off the coast. We know now, in the luxury of hindsight, there's around 20,000 people have been put through a wood chipper, basically, right? There was 100,000 wounded, right, or more. Significant. They didn't die, but a vicious wounding they took from the debris, right? Because, like, when you're talking about a tsunami, like when you talk about a supercell typhoon, a cyclone, a supercell hurricane, winds of 150 miles per hour, they're picking up all kinds of objects and turning them into projectiles. When you're in a tsunami, it's the same kind of thing, right? Where everything is a projectile that you're brought into because you're coming at such a high rate of speed. 4 foreign search and rescue teams, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, the United States, none of them at the nuclear plant. All of them are looking for victims, which is appropriate. But again, they didn't let anybody go to the nuclear plant. Even today, right? There's no foreign companies working at the nuclear plant. The nuclear disaster, the nuclear event. Desperation panic grips Japan after the quake. I can't imagine. It's just horrifying. Survivors of the Japan's devastating earthquake tsunami huddled in shelters, hoarding supplies. Yeah, of course they are. You get all these strangers together. No one's going to come and bring them anything. They're hoarding. What do you mean hoarding supplies? They scavenged up enough. Because when you're talking about groups of people in a place, they need a lot of toilet paper. They need a lot of diapers. They need a lot of, water and basic stuff. And they didn't have it. The roads were moving up and down like a wave. They were on fire and it was snowing. That's a significant statement too, because the radioactive fallout the industry tried to pass it off as pollen. Adding to the panic, radiation leaked. Again, the word leaked. So clearly, like when you're hearing this consistently from every direction, you don't see the words radioactive fallout, you don't see. Tens of thousands of people were forced to evacuate, many seeking refuge in shelters wrapped in blankets, some clutching each other, sobbing. Yeah. At least 1,300 people were killed by the earthquake. That was the first time, by the way, you've seen any kind of emotion expressed. At least 1,300 people were killed by the earthquake. We know now it's like 18 times that. In Tokyo, where many have long feared the prospect of another monster earthquake on the scale that killed 140,000 people in 1923 in Tokyo. Tokyo's right on a tectonic plate. It's a stupid place to live, man. Many remaining panic-stricken about the continuing chaos elsewhere. That's the nuclear industry. It was going on like chicken with their head chopped off. Especially as radiation leaked. I despise that word with a passion. From the nuclear reactors. I've never heard the word leak. It's just disgusting, isn't it? Japan handed out iodine to survivors. Really? How are you going to get it to them after a tsunami came through? And that's not going to help you. The only reason you're handing out iodine is because something's really bad. They don't give that or whatever. And as far as I know, they didn't pass out any. Japanese authorities have told the United Nations Atomic Watchdog. Again, right away. UN Atomic Watchdog. They are making preparations to distribute iodine to people. But they got to get permission before you do anything to this organization known as UN. It has no sovereignty over any country, but everybody's still got to give permission. No, the stories are written by UN to put that connotation out there, see? They're making preparations to distribute iodine to people living near nuclear disease plants affected by the earthquake on Friday, the day before. Iodine can be used to help protect the body from radioactive exposure. No, it can't. You got to take it a long time before the nuclear meltdown. And it's not going to protect you even if it does that, because the gamma, which is iodine-131, is going to go somewhere else and cause just as much. It doesn't need to be aggregated into the thyroid. Clearly it was. I mean, when you had 13,646 children out of 38,000, which is like 35% of the population, when it used to be 1 in a million with thyroid tumors. And these tumors were the same size as their thyroid, 2 centimeters. You didn't hand out any iodine, or it didn't work, one or the other or both. In Japan on Saturday, radiation leaked from a damaged nuclear reactor after an explosion blew the roof off. It didn't blow the roof off. It doesn't work. What could cause the explosion? It came from the meltdown, the emissions from the meltdown. And the pressure, right? There was a pressure. We know it was double the 1,000 pounds per square inch normally is. So once that ruptures, explodes, that's an explosion. Imagine pumping your tire up to 2,000 pounds per square inch. That's quite the explosion on its own, right? But then you have the hydrogen build up. Once that hits oxygen, that explodes. It keeps the explosion a continuous, like, huge explosion. There was lots of mini explosions in the atmosphere around the site for many years from the huge hydrogen releases from the meltdowns. It was ongoing for years and years and years. It would go up in the air, and then it had displaced all the local air, oxygen locally. The government insisted the radiation levels were low. It can't be low once you have an explosion at a fuel pool, right? The fuel reactor 3 is already detonated at this stage, right? Reactor 3 is getting ready to detonate. Reactor 3 behind me, reactor 1 to your left. Once that happens, you're not getting in the site. You're not going walking around. You're not going running around. You're not going to fly through there in a helicopter. You're doing nothing. You die right away. It's a death sentence immediately for anything and everybody. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN nuclear body, the worst humans I've ever come across. The Japan's authorities had informed it of the explosion. So the idea was to give big prominence to the nuclear industry, the International Degenerate Agency, rather, UN, immediately and perpetually. Because they're the one who are going to make up the narrative to fix the nuclear industry that was already in desperation mode as it was. So they sacrificed all the species, all humans, to promote the nuclear industry. Hello, everybody. I hope everybody's doing good. I apologize doing a show again on Saturday. We did one last Saturday too, didn't we? 7 shows in 8 days, not bad. Not on purpose, but that's just the way it worked out. That of the nearby Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. So you had an evacuation zone, and as far as I don't know how they can connect the power at the Daiichi. I'll never understand. I refused at this stage, after all the research we've done on it, and we have a lot of documentation, that happened. They covered it up, right? If not, why didn't they reopen some of the reactors? See? International Atomic Energy Agency reiterated its offer of technical assistance to Japan should the government request it. In other words, because they're not a regulatory agency, they're not the authority. The International Atomic Energy Agency, UN, are put on a pedestal because that's how it works in this nuclear mob. They don't have any authority, any sovereignty over any country. And then that's how they were controlling the narrative, but they put it out there that they were friendly, maybe. And in other words, unless Japan directly asked them for help, they weren't going to interfere. When you had, you knew all the reactors were going to melt down. And because the fuel pool had already went, the common spin fuel pool. A scene from a disaster movie, said one lady. I can't even imagine. Adding to the panic, radiation leaked from an unstable nuclear reactor in the Fukushima prefecture. Adding to the panic, radiation leaked. So you used every opportunity to downplay it in every single story. Helicopter plucked survivors from an elementary school in Sendai, 62 miles further south in Koriyama. Koriyama, of course, they moved people back into, that's a nuclear wasteland. 300,000 people live there, and you're talking about 300,000 counts per square meter of just cesium-137 in a degenerate UN study. At least 1,700 people feared killed by the earthquake. So it's very early in the story, isn't it? In one town, Miyagi Prefecture, 9,500 people could not be contacted, about half its population. So you're just in the day, barely in the day two in many ways in that story right there. In nearby, a nearly flattened village in far northern Iwate Prefecture, I can't pronounce it, 10,000 missing after a quake. People watched the aftermath of the tidal wave in Keshinuma in Miyagi Prefecture, northeastern Japan. Okay, so never mind. Lost my train of thought. An explosion at a Japanese nuclear plant triggered fears of a meltdown on Saturday, Sendai. Workers doused a stricken reactor with seawater. No, they didn't. There was nothing functional, right? And everything was already... That is the nuclear site right there. Even as Japan struggled to assess the full extent of the devastation, the nation faced an atomic energy emergency as cooling systems damaged by the quake failed at 2 nuclear reactors. No, it failed at all the reactors. There was no power. Smoke billowed, which is the nuclear meltdown. Number 1 atomic plant, Fukushima Daiichi. After an explosion blew the roof off and the walls of the structure around the reactor. No, the reactor was below that. That was the fuel pool evaporated. Right there. It's to your left. You couldn't get back on the site once that happened. You had 9 reactor cores blown all over the site. Fuel rods and fuel assemblies all over the place. So that's the definition of hell. It don't matter who you are, you can't survive in that environment. Radiation leaked from the plant again. It was ejected right out of the building's reactor cores. And the government moved to calm the fears of the meltdown. They sure did. And they wouldn't have done it without the blessings of the International Atomic Energy Agency, saying that the blast did not rupture the container surrounding the reactor. So refusing to acknowledge the fuel pool doesn't mean that, right? Focusing on the reactor instead of the fuel pool was their get out of jail card. So I'm pretending that was the building when it was actually the fuel pool, same as reactor 4 in reactor 3. And in the video, you actually can see the fuel pools and the reactor cores falling back down to Earth. It was the same thing for reactor 1, except they didn't eject it as high, right? Radiation leaked from the plant, but the government moved to calm fears of the meltdown. Did not rupture the containment surrounding the reactor, which simply wasn't true. It was 100%. Now, once they've already seen the video, they had better pictures than me in New York. I can show you. Japan's Nuclear Safety Agency rated it as a 4. I mean, we're talking about 9 reactor cores, each one of them equal to 100 Chernobyls. Pure uranium, pure plutonium. Chernobyl was a brand new reactor. It was a graphite reactor. 3 Mile Island accident in the United States was rated as a 5. There's no comparison. It didn't have decades of reactor cores stored above the reactor at the top of the buildings. Fukushima, the reactor cores were stored at the top of the buildings. So this is how they tricked everybody, was by talking about the reactor instead of the fuel pool. Now, I'm sure over the next few days the fuel pool gets mentioned. I never made it that far because that's just the way it played out yesterday in the day. NHK quoted the safety agency as saying metal tubes that contain uranium fuel may have melted. The safety agency being IAEA. Media reports said 3 residents, bedridden patients evacuated from a hospital near the plant in this Fukushima, have been found to be exposed to radiation after spending a long time outdoors awaiting rescue. They abandoned 90 dementia patients right next to the reactors in north of it, which is Fukushima Hospital. The number of people exposed to radiation is expected to climb to 90. No, everybody was radiated. Radiation right at this stage was probably reaching Tokyo. Said it was critical to cool the reactor core to avoid a meltdown that would result in a large release of radiation. So just because they refused to acknowledge what was happening, remember it actually happened. Up to 400 bodies recovered. I can't pronounce the name. Coastal town, 23,000 people. So really early. This is still really early in the story, isn't it? The premier spokesman said at least 1,000 people were believed to have lost their lives. And now we know it's almost 20,000, right? The United States, which has 50,000 military personnel in Japan, ordered a flotilla, including 2 aircraft carriers, and their support ships to the region to provide aid. And we know they're within 1 kilometer of the ongoing nuclear meltdowns. The whole ship was completely contaminated, where they went in a dry dock 3 times and grinded down the decks and everything, trying to get rid of the radioactive signatures, radioactive fallout. Japan sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire. Tokyo is one of the most dangerous areas, with 3 continental plates, and they build up enormous seismic pressures. So the 3 continental plates meet under Tokyo. And they got 36 million people there. These people are friggin' idiots. Radiation leaked low enough, whatever that means. What does that mean? What does that even mean? Radiation leaked low enough. That's reactor 1. So they're showing you the pictures at this stage. This is Saturday, right? Video footage shows smoke. That's not smoke. That's an explosion, so it can't be smoke. Smoke comes after, right? Rising from Fukushima, it's the nuclear meltdown. Smoke takes a long time to create. This was created in a millisecond. A nuclear reactor after, get my head out of the way, an explosion. Right, exactly, after an explosion. It didn't blow the roof off the unstable reactor, it blew the fuel out of the fuel pool, which was 8 reactor cores. And crippled, there's that word, the world's worst nuclear disaster in 25 years. There's that framing that we've been listening to ever since. The previous day, thousands were evacuated following an explosion and leak. How can you have an explosion and a leak? From the facility's #1 reactor? No, it was from the fuel pool. It lost 2 fuel pools in that 48 hours. Reactor 1 and Reactor 3. Then it lost Reactor 2 and Reactor 4 fuel pools. So it's 36 reactor cores total at the top of 4 of the buildings and 8 fuel pools. Nuclear plant operator TEPCO, the worst humans imaginable, but their job is you blame them instead of the nuclear industry and the International Atomic Energy Agencies and such, because that's where the blame should go, right? The Nuclear Energy Institute said radiation levels around the Fukushima Daiichi plant had risen above the safety limits, but it did not mean an immediate threat to human health. Of course it did. You mean that's not an immediate threat? Of course it is. Your organs melt. If you're in anywhere, you walk in there, anywhere, your organs melt right away. You die right away. It said it was preparing to vent steam to relieve pressure #3 reactor. And the government had warned of a rise in radiation during the procedure. Thousands spent another freezing night huddled. The number of dead or unaccounted was expected to exceed 1,800. So still very early in this story, wasn't it? Reported that there was no contact with 10,000 people in one town and more than half its population. And insisted radiation levels were low, the government did, following Saturday's explosions. No, it can't be low. These are catastrophic, lethal plumes way off site, not just right there. But right there, there is no survival there. Saying the blast not affected the reactor core container. How can you quantify that? Who went in there and quantified that assertion? The International Atomic Energy Agency said, again, why are they being quoted? They're not even in Japan. Said Japan had told it that the levels have been observed to be lessened in recent hours. It went from horrifically lethal to unbelievably lethal, did it? Still lethal. Officials said 22 people were known to be exposed to radiation. Total 190 have been within 6 miles 6-mile radius of the reactor. There was lethal doses there. There's 3,000 people died within the next few weeks, right? They didn't die of stress, like the industry wants you to believe. That's the cover story. Workers in protective clothing were scanning people arriving at the evacuation center for radioactive exposures, dressed in paper suits, and the minute the Geiger counter comes in at high numbers, is no longer functional. You can imagine, though, the Geiger counters they were given were garbage, right? And you have to really know how to work the Geiger counter properly. Just turning it on is a trick on its own. It's meaningless. We have lots of pictures of them where they got hundreds of people lined up and everybody's walking up to this table where somebody scans the top of your head and says, no, you're okay, go ahead. They're working on relieving pressure and pumping in water at number 3 reactor. You weren't doing nothing because reactor 1 blew up alongside of number 3. So there was no way you're walking around number 3. And how are you going to put pressure in 1,000 pounds per square inch after tsunami ran through your site? Right? There's nothing functional. And it's an amazing trick to pump pressure into 1,000 pounds per square inch. But by this point, you're up around 2,000 pounds per square inch. So how are you going to pump 30 psi water source to 2,000 pounds per square inch when everything is destroyed? They weren't. So who was coordinating this story so well that everybody played their part? I wonder. It had to be the International Atomic Energy Agency / United Nations, the traitors of humanity and the traitors of the 8 million species. He also said radiation from the number 1 reactor was low enough not to affect people's health. Again, this is absurd to even suggest it for a second. So why were they? Because that was the cover story, right? They were setting it had to be coordinated for it to work. Every university, every media had to play their part for that to work that way. Around 140,000 people left the area. The IAEA said. Well, authorities prepared to distribute iodine to protect people from the radioactive exposure. It doesn't work that way. Right? And so they use these opportunities to brainwash the people just in case it happens again. There is radiation leaking out, and since the possibility of being exposed is high, it's quite scary, said a young person. Standing in line on Saturday to be scanned for radiation at the evacuation center in Fukushima Prefecture. TEPCO had been pumping water in number 1 reactor to cool it down. No, they weren't. It doesn't work that way. It's not like a campfire, okay? It's burning at 9,000 degree Fahrenheit temperatures at this stage. They used to see whatever was left. The use of seawater means they have run out of options. And if they had any other water, they would have used it. It likely means the power for the pumps is gone, and they must be pumping the seawater in, says the director of the Union of Non-Concerned Scientists Nuclear Safety Project. So he would have known a couple of things. He would have known that the reactor exploded. So he would have known his statement then was untrue. And he would have known that the tsunami ran through it. So again, he would have known that that statement was simply untrue. And because the reactor exploded, and so the Union of Unconcerned Scientists, the International Atomic Energy Agency, played a significant part, didn't they? We see that over and over. We're getting through this stuff. We'll get there. I guess we did do a full show, but it looks like it. In Europe, that's the way it goes, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I don't know. Hopefully it's fortunate. In Europe, environmentalists seized on the action to press for an end to nuclear power. Up to 60,000 protesters formed a 27-mile, 45-kilometer human chain in Germany to denounce the government's policy of extending the life of a nuclear disease factory. Before news of the problem with reactor number 3, the Nuclear Safety Agency said the plant accident was less serious than both 3 Mile Island in 1979 and Chernobyl. It was less serious before, like reactor 1 was 800 times worse, 900 times worse than Chernobyl. It was a couple thousand times worse than 3 Mile Island. because its reactors were pure uranium, pure plutonium. It had decades of reactor cores and fuel pools at the top of the buildings. All of that was lost. The inventory comparison is catastrophic difference, see? And type of inventory, the type of fuel. In Europe, environmentalists seen on we already done that one. An official at the agency said it rated the incident. Wait, now I got to get my wheel of fortune up. Click, 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 click. 4. According to the International Nuclear Radiological Event Scale, which is, these scales were created by International Atomic Energy Agency, not the Nuclear and International Nuclear Radiological Event Scale. That's what that was created by, rather, was the IAEA, the least trustworthy humans known to exist. 4 trains were unaccounted for after the tsunami. Many Japanese flooded social networking sites with worries about the plant. Says, I can't trust TEPCO. No, that's what they want you to do, blame TEPCO. Can't trust your government under any circumstances, and you can't trust the nuclear industry under any circumstances whatsoever. Zero possibility you can trust anything they say. Radiation fears grow, scores evacuated. They show you these pictures, right? You can't protect yourself with that kind of clothing on at nuclear meltdown sites. That you can't go in there and survive for very long with that. This stuff will pulse energy, kill you through 4 feet of wood, for instance. So how's a paper suit going to protect you? Or in that case, I think they're Tyvek, right? High levels of radioactive material detected in the reactor buildings. A Japanese top government spokesperson warned Sunday of a fresh threat of explosion from a nuclear unit at Atomic Reactor 3. A hydrogen explosion could occur at Unit 3, hydrogen explosion. So, like, they're calling it hydrogen before it even happened. You can't quantify it till many, many months or years later, whether it was a hydrogen or a nuclear excursion or a steam explosion or criticality event. That would follow a blast that took place on Saturday at the same power plant, which was Reactor 1. Once Reactor 1 happened, that's a no-go zone. Well, it's a nuclear wasteland. That would follow a blast that took place Saturday at the same power plant, and as operators attempt to prevent a nuclear meltdown in another unit by ejecting seawater into it. You couldn't eject seawater into Reactor 3, because that's what they're talking about. Right? You need multiple thousand pounds per square inch to force in to where it's already multiple thousand pounds per square inch. A garden hose doesn't work. Pumping water from the ocean doesn't work that way. As operators attempt to prevent a nuclear meltdown by injecting seawater into it, Idano said the mechanical problems. It wasn't mechanical problems. The building was torn apart. It didn't exist. There was no infrastructure to power on top of that. It's dependent upon external influences to power. So it needs an external gas, oil, coal plant, 2 of them dedicated to each site because they're so resource intensive. Nuclear is the most resource intensive industry, period. The pump delayed the injection of cooling water into the reactor, leaving the fuel rods briefly exposed. What do you mean briefly exposed? Raising the risk of both a nuclear meltdown and an explosion. Well, if they were still in the containment, the water is evaporated, but it's turned into steam. So the fuel now is just going to swell. And the pressure is increasing, so the pressure will detonate. And then the emissions, when they're vaporized, exposed to oxygen, they're going to detonate too. So it's a very significant explosion we're talking about, which shatters all the fuel rods, and that stuff immediately catches fire at the same time because the cladding, right, is combustible when it touches oxygen, sees oxygen. It doesn't need oxygen to burn forever on top of that. Japan rushes to avert a nuclear meltdown. Caretakers carry a woman evacuated from a nursing home located in an evacuation area at a temporary shelter in Koriyama. Every house in Koriyama is entitled to be decontaminated, every building, every school, every mall, every bank. But they haven't got enough homeless people to go around, and you can't decontaminate the buildings. You need to evacuate that city of 300,000 people. Which is quite the black eye for the nuclear industry, so they didn't do it. They said, the hell with them. They can get sick and die, we couldn't care less. And that was their attitude, they're heartless. And that's what you always get with this industry. It has no emotions, right, whatsoever. It's just completely ruthless, scumbaggery, heartless. And the nuclear industry is put before everything, the entire planet. The nuclear industry comes before every species. It's better that everything dies than the nuclear industry gets a black eye. That's how they work. They're not human like me or you. They don't care. They were born without the gene to care, right? Nuclear plant operators were frantically trying to keep the temperatures down. No, they weren't. You couldn't do nothing. You were in no man's land, and there was no way back. Officials feared a partial meltdown could be happening on Sunday. It's reactor 3. So the hydrogen explosion could occur at Unit 3 of the Fukushima. The latest reactor faced a possible meltdown. Like to frame it that way, without any prominence, is really telling too. That followed a blast the day before in the power plant's Unit 1, and the operators attempted to prevent a meltdown there by injecting seawater into Reactor 3 and Reactor 1. You can't do that. How are you going to inject seawater into it unless it's already open? Oh, that's where I left off. So Reactor 3 was about to explode is where I left off on Sunday morning. So over those next few hours, Reactor 3 exploded. That's where I'll be picking up. That's why I took that particular screen capture, so I know where to pick up. I know where to pick up when I go, because I closed the browser down. I need a reference, right, to find my way back, so I don't have to do double stuff. That's the show. It's a weird show, I know, I'll get it, right? But it was just trying to show you that the first four. I was not trying to show you. I was going through the headlines because I'm stupid. That's what I do, right? I do it all the time, 24 hours a day. I'm always looking at this stuff. And so I seen them changing. IOL was changing, redacting facets of the stories. So I decided to go over and look up the stories that they had there and see if I can get it. Because my brain works really weird sometimes. I thought I was able to go in there, grab a whole bunch of stories, and when they show up again later, I can go in and show you the comparison of what they actually took out from the site. Instead, I got, here's the first 48-hour version. And I had this epiphany that this was clearly the cover story. We were looking at the cover story, how it formulated in the first 24 and 48 hours. Right, and that because we covered all of that narrative you see now is the exact same narrative that they're singing 14 years later. Anyway, I felt that if I didn't do the show tonight, it wouldn't get done because I still haven't got to Chernobyl's anniversary, which was last month. I still haven't done those yet. We've done 8 anniversary videos for Fukushima this year, for instance. 8 2-hour plus videos. But this information is important, otherwise I wouldn't put you through all of this. Because we can refer to this later, see? We can see definitively how the cover story played out. That's so important. Which means I also now got to go all the way up until the 16th or 17th even, to show you how the rest of it played out, because now I'm committed. Now that I've done this one, my brain says I have to. So we're looking at another 2-3 videos on this, which could very well start tomorrow night, knowing Dana. You know how stupid I am. Anyway, a rough day yesterday, a fairly rough day today. I'm still here. Hear me, nuclear industry? I'm still here, bitches. Ain't going nowhere. Bear with me. Oh, no way, man. James got another song out. That's cool. That's a good way to end the day. That makes me happy. Let's get it over with. How long we been screaming for here? Hour and 54? We still got to kill 6 minutes, so we got to kill the next 3 minutes. Might as well make it a 2-hour show tonight. I made it this far. I wasn't even paying attention. It was a good thing too, because I would have gave up if I had of. Yeah, hi everybody. All right. James got a new song. Yeah, let's play that. How about that? That's a good idea. Did the International Atomic Energy Agency know explosions at reactor 1 and 3 were fuel pools detonating, not hydrogen damage to structures? Of course they did, right? But the official story is they didn't. I'm going to adjust the volume for you in real time here, just to make sure the video is in 1080, because I have played some of his songs that were just posted in low quality, and then had to go and try to fix it because it sounds better in high. Bespoke and collapse, pseudo. I can't even pronounce that one. Pseudo Nietzsche chord. It's got a link there or something. Horrific worse algae, is it? Let's see what the song is about. This is what he made this song in the video because he was influenced by this story. Horrific scene on the California coast. The largest algae boom on record is killing thousands of marine animals. Just hang on, I gotta sneeze. Hang on. An interesting statement there. He says, we're dealing with the numbers in 2-month period we'd normally deal with in a year. But the numbers in the 2-month or the year is not normal pre-Fukushima, it's normal post-Fukushima. A lot of times I can only sneeze, I'm supposed to sneeze twice. We're going to be covering that during the die-off video I got put together, that story, I'm sure. And look at this, he doesn't even put the word climate change in the headlines. But United Nations has put this junk underneath his video. Anyway, we'll see tomorrow night probably. Don't burn myself out. Have a great night. Hugs for everybody. See everybody on the next one. Take care. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up. If you make it this far, subscribe. Blah, 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 blah. Just kidding, yeah. Take care.
Thermocline stored by zestalins, autolyzed and sprawled, no carapace, no calcium shell, the benthic bed had gone unwell, no samples drawn, no water columns traced, the trophy chain was left erased.
Bands spread wide, no warnings, aghast, the water turned. Then dark and fast, sea lions froze, their heads went low, their limbs convulsed, their breath let go.
No changes showed in early feeds, the toxic load rose through the weeds. once observed a color tide, but no one looked beneath the glide.
They blamed the mix they dropped by air, said surface bloom was runoff, and no isotopes were ever named. The molten cores remained classified.
Inquiry was never made, no half-life marked, no technical leads. The anchovy biomass dropped, no visual red of loss occurred.
The deaths accrued, the door stayed closed, no action called, no process posed. The algae surged, the tide line browned, dead whales washed up without a sound.
It crossed exclusion zones unmarked, the systems failed without remark. No monitor returned the ping, no gamma trace beneath the wing.
They called it noon to close the file. The cause was clear, no test compiled.
The smoke collapsed, the awkward remains, the breach sustained, the